The first thing I heard wasn't a scream. It was the clinical metallic click of a deadbolt sliding into place, sealing me into the cold, damp darkness of my own basement. It's a sound that should mean security, but in that moment, it sounded like the lid of a coffin closing. Standing on the other side of that door was Bryn Ashford, my daughter-in-law, the woman who had spent the last 3 years calling me Dad while she calculated the exact price of my life. "You should start getting used to the basement, Silas." Her voice drifted through the wood, icy and devoid of the honeyed warmth she used for the neighbors. "This house is only for people who are still useful. Think of it as a retirement home with a much shorter commute." I stood there in the dark, the smell of furnace oil and 30 years of forgotten secrets pressing against my lungs. I am Silas Vance, a 68-year-old retired bridge inspector. I spent 4 decades suspended over rivers, looking for the tiny hairline fractures in steel that could bring a 100-ton structure screaming into the abyss. I was an expert at spotting rot before it became a catastrophe. Yet, I had missed the crumbling of my own sanctuary until the pillars were already gone. My son, Kellen, had been dead for exactly 14 days. They told me it was complications from his type 1 diabetes, a tragic, sudden decline. But as I stood in that dark cellar, clutching a single torn photograph of him I'd managed to snatch from the trash, I realized the math didn't add up. Kellen was a civil engineer. He lived by precision, by logic. He wouldn't just forget his insulin. He wouldn't just fade away. I fumbled for the pull string of the single naked bulb overhead. It flickered to life, casting long, skeletal shadows across the damp concrete. My workbench, the place where I'd taught Kellen how to bevel edges and respect the grain of the wood, was buried under heavy black trash bags. They weren't filled with junk. They were filled with my life, my clothes, my journals, my bridge inspection manuals. It wasn't just a mess. It was a deliberate burial. A muffled, rhythmic creak came from the floorboards directly above my head. Someone was standing perfectly still just on the other side of the door, listening. I didn't argue. I didn't pound on the wood and demand to be let out. Instead, I moved with the practiced silence of a man used to walking on suspension cables. I reached behind a stack of structural reports for a small metal safe I kept hidden in the rafters. My hand met jagged, cold air instead of smooth steel. The safe was gone. My birth certificate, my social security card, and most importantly, the deed to this Michigan property vacuumed out. I sank onto a plastic crate, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. I realized then that Bryn hadn't just stolen my room, she was erasing my legal existence. But as I looked down at the grit-covered floor, I saw a lone scrap of paper that had fallen from the thief's grasp. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was a copy of a voluntary power of attorney transfer. At the bottom, staring back at me in bold black ink, was my own signature. It was a perfect replica, a forgery so precise it made my skin crawl. I didn't know it yet. I whispered into the dark, but she had already started the clock on my own heart. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The blue, sterile glow reflected off the damp walls like a cold digital eye. I had one person left in this world who understood the difference between an accident and an execution. I hit the call button, the hollow ring echoing through the rafters. "Garrett," I whispered when he picked up, my voice trembling with a mix of shame and fury. "She's boxed me in. My papers are gone. And Garrett, I think they murdered Kellen." The silence on the other end lasted only a second before my brother, a retired Detroit homicide detective, spoke in a rasp that cut through my panic. "Stay in the dark, Silas. Don't confront her. If she's playing for the house, she's playing for keeps. I'm coming." Just as I hung up, the shadow under the door moved. The floorboards groaned. Then, a small, rhythmic thud-thud-thud started. It was the sound of someone hammering a nail. They weren't just locking me in. They were boarding me up. The sound of the first nail biting into the doorframe felt like a spike being driven into my own chest. Thud, thud, thud. Bryn wasn't even pretending anymore. Most people wait for the body to get cold before they start the looting. But Bryn, and her new shadow, Milo Redmond, were moving with the frantic, ugly haste of vultures who knew the storm was coming. Milo was a construction foreman I'd seen lurking around the property for months, supposedly consulting on some renovations Kellen wanted. Now I could hear his heavy tread in the kitchen, his boots thumping with a territorial entitlement that made my stomach turn. He was 39, built like a brick wall, with eyes that always seemed to be calculating the scrap value of everything he looked at. "Is the old man secure?" I heard Milo ask. His voice was a low, guttural rumble that carried through the vents. "He's exactly where he belongs," Bryn replied. I could hear the clink of ice against glass. She was celebrating. Silas has always lived in the past. Now he can rot in it. I leaned my back against the cold concrete wall, trying to slow my breathing. As a bridge inspector, I knew that panic was the fastest way to lose your footing. I had to look at this house like a failing structure. Where were the load-bearing lies? Where was the hidden rot? I began to survey my cage with a clinical eye. The basement was a sprawling, unfinished space that smelled of 30 years of Michigan winters. In the far corner sat the furnace, a cast-iron beast that groaned like a living thing. Beside it was the old coal chute, my potential exit. I moved toward it, my boots crunching on grit, only to find my heart sinking. A fresh, silver bead of weld ran along the seam of the iron door. Milo had sealed it from the outside. I wasn't just in a basement, I was in a vault. I didn't know it then, I whispered, but they had been preparing this cell for me long before Kellen took his last breath. I moved back to my workbench and began digging through the black trash bags they'd tossed down. Amidst my tangled sweaters and old blueprints, my hand hit something hard and cold. It was Kellen's old engineering laptop. My heart leaped. Bryn must have thought it was junk, or perhaps she didn't realize it was buried in my things. I opened the lid, the soft glow of the screen feeling like a campfire in the wilderness. The battery was at 12%. I needed a charger, and I knew exactly where it was plugged into the outlet right next to the basement door just out of my reach. As I stared at the door, I heard a different sound, a lighter, softer footstep. Pop, pop. It was Quinn, my 9-year-old granddaughter. Her voice was a thin ribbon of terror, muffled by the wood and the newly nailed boards. "Quinn, honey, I'm here," I said, pressing my face to the gap in the door. "Are you okay?" "Mommy said you're sick," she sobbed. "She said you have the forgetting sickness like Daddy had at the end. She said if I come near the door, I'll get sick too." My blood ran cold. The forgetting sickness. Kellen didn't have dementia. He had organ failure. Bryn was already planting the seeds of my own cognitive decline in the mind of the only person who could testify for me. She was gaslighting a 9-year-old to cover her tracks. "I'm not sick, Quinn. Listen to me," I urged, my voice a desperate whisper. "I need you to be a big girl. There's a black cord plugged into the wall right next to the door. Can you push it under the gap? Just for pop-pop?" I waited, my pulse hammering in my ears. I heard her small fingers fumbling against the floorboards. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Milo's laughter from the living room. Then, the end of the charging cable poked through the narrow space beneath the door like a lifeline. "I love you, Pop-Pop," she whispered. "I love you too, Quinn. Now go, don't let them see you here." I plugged the laptop in, the orange charging light blinking like a heartbeat. I knew Kellen's password. It was the same one he'd used for everything. The day Quinn was born. Numui, lumui lum. The desktop loaded, and my breath hitched. Kellen hadn't just been working on bridge designs. The main folder on his desktop was titled, Structural Integrity, Home. I clicked it open, and what I saw next changed everything. It wasn't a folder of documents, it was a direct link to a hidden cloud server, and the first file was a video time-stamped the night before he died. In the thumbnail I could see Kellen sitting at the kitchen table, looking gray and hollowing out, but his eyes were fixed directly on the smoke detector in the foyer. He wasn't looking at the alarm. He was looking at a lens. My son, the engineer, had turned his own house into a witness, and as I hit play, I realized that the woman upstairs wasn't just a thief. She was an executioner. The video flickered to life, the graininess of the low-light sensor making Kellen look like a ghost even before he was gone. He was sitting at the kitchen island, his shoulders hunched, a shadow of the man who used to hike the Appalachian Trail with me. I watched, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the edges of the laptop. As Bryn entered the frame, she was wearing her silk robe, her hair perfectly coiffed. She didn't look like a woman nursing a dying husband. She looked like an executive overseeing a closing deal. She set a ceramic mug down in front of him, the one that said "World's Best Dad," and leaned over to kiss his forehead. It was a gesture of such practiced tenderness that it made the bile rise in my throat. "Drink it all, Kel," she whispered on the recording. "It's the special electrolyte blend the doctor sent over. It'll help with the tremors." Kellen took a long, shaky sip. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with a mix of exhaustion and a terrifying, dawning realization. "It tastes sweet, Bryn. Like syrup. Is it supposed to be that sweet?" "It's the glucose stabilizer, honey. Just rest." She turned away from him then, and for a split second, she looked directly toward the smoke detector where the camera was hidden. She didn't know it was there, but she was checking the room, her face shifting from a mask of concern to a chilling, vacant coldness. She picked up his phone from the counter, her thumb swiping with the ease of someone who had long ago cracked his passcode. I watched as she deleted a notification and alert from his continuous glucose monitor. She wasn't just letting him die, she was actively silencing his body's cries for help. I realized then, I rasped into the silence of the basement, that Kellen wasn't rambling about smoke and clocks in the hospital. He was giving me the coordinates of his evidence. I paused the video, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them against the workbench. My son had spent his final days building a digital cage for his own killer. But as I looked at the file directory, I saw something even more sinister. There was a subfolder titled Basement Sensors. I clicked it, and a live audio feed crackled to life. It was a baby monitor frequency, hidden somewhere in the rafters above my head. "Is he still down there?" Milo's voice came through the laptop speakers, sharp and clear. He sounded like he was standing right in the kitchen above me. "He's quiet," Bryn replied. "The first dose of the supplement should be hitting his system about now." I put it in his water jug before we locked the door. I froze. My gaze darted to the blue plastic water jug sitting on the corner of my workbench. I had taken a long drink from it only 20 minutes ago to wash down the dust in my throat. I moved to the jug, tipping it toward the dim light of the single bulb. There, clinging to the inner rim, was a faint, crystalline residue, a telltale blue tint that looked like crushed sapphires. Antifreeze. They weren't waiting for the forgetting sickness to take me. They were fast-tracking the process. The sweetness in my mouth wasn't just a memory from the video, it was a physical reality. My heart began to race not from fear, but from the first chemical spikes of the poison. I had to get out. I had to get the laptop to Garrett. But the door was boarded, the cold chute was welded, and the only window was a narrow strip of glass 10 feet up, reinforced with steel bars. Then, I heard the heavy clunk of the kitchen chair being moved above me. "I'm going down to check on him," Milo said. "If he's as confused as you say, we might need to help him finish that jug. We can't have your brother showing up tomorrow and finding him too lucid." The deadbolt groaned as it was unlocked. The sound of the nails being pried back with a crowbar echoed like gunshots. Scree crunch, scree crunch. I looked at the laptop, then at the heavy sledgehammer I'd found in the trash bags. I was a 68-year-old man with a heart condition and a liter of poison in my gut, but I was still a Vance. And if Milo Redmond thought he was walking into a room with a victim, he was about to learn everything I knew about structural collapse. I killed the laptop screen, plunged the basement into total darkness, and gripped the sledgehammer. What I saw next, I whispered to the shadows, was the moment the bridge finally gave way. The footsteps on the stairs weren't the hurried pace of someone worried about a sick relative. They were slow, heavy, and deliberate, the sound of a man coming to finish a chore. Creak, thump, creak. Each step vibrated through the old wooden risers, sending a fine dust of dry rot onto my shoulders. I stood pressed against the brick chimney stack, the sledgehammer cold and heavy in my grip, my heart thundering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The door at the top of the stairs groaned open, throwing a long, jagged spear of kitchen light down into the gloom. Milo's silhouette was a massive, distorted shadow that stretched all the way to the far wall. "Silas," he called out. His voice had a mocking, sing-song quality. "You still awake, old man? Bryn's worried you aren't staying hydrated." I didn't answer. I didn't breathe. I watched him descend, a flashlight in his left hand and something heavy, a roll of industrial duct tape in his right. He reached the bottom and panned the beam across the room. It danced over the trash bags, the empty cot, and the workbench. When the light hit the blue water jug, Milo let out a low, satisfied grunt. "Empty already? Good for you," he chuckled. unaware I'd poured the contents into the drain of the utility sink minutes before. Makes things a lot easier for everyone. He turned his back to me, heading toward the workbench to grab the laptop he'd finally realized was missing from the study upstairs. That was his mistake. He thought I was a broken structure, a bridge past its service life. He didn't realize that even a crumbling bridge can still crush what's beneath it if it falls the right way. I stepped out from behind the chimney. The movement was silent, a phantom glide I'd learned from 40 years of walking narrow steel girders. I didn't swing for his head. I wasn't a murderer. I swung for the one thing a construction foreman values most: his foundation. The heavy head of the sledgehammer connected with the back of Milo's knee with a sickening wet crack. He let out a choke scream, his leg buckling instantly. He hit the concrete floor hard, the flashlight spinning away and illuminating the underside of the furnace. Before he could scramble for his phone or find his footing, I was over him. I didn't feel like a 68-year-old man in that moment. I felt like the hand of God. "Where are my papers, Milo?" I rasped, the adrenaline masking the dull ache in my chest. You crazy old fossil," he wheezed, clutching his shattered knee. "Bryn's already filed the paperwork. You're incompetent. You're a ghost." "I've spent my life looking at ghosts in the steel, son," I said, leaning in until he could see the cold, hard clarity in my eyes. "I know how to find what's hidden." I grabbed the duct tape he'd brought down, likely intended for my own mouth, and used it to anchor him to the heavy cast iron leg of the workbench. He fought, he cursed, he tried to bite, but a lifetime of securing cables meant my knots didn't slip. Once he was secure, I snatched his phone from his pocket. It was unlocked. My eyes widened as I scrolled through his recent texts. There was a message from Bryn sent 10 minutes ago. "Is it done? The estate lawyer is calling at 10 a.m. I need to tell him." Silas passed peacefully in his sleep, but it was the next message that stopped my blood from flowing. It was a photo of a small, nondescript white bottle sitting on the kitchen counter, next to a glass of milk. Bryn's caption read, "Quinn won't stop crying. I'm going to give her a little calming supplement so we can get through the night. The blue syrup. She was going to use it on the child." I looked at the stairs, then at the narrow window. My brother Garrett wouldn't be here for hours. I was trapped in a basement with a crippled predator, while a monster was tucking my granddaughter into bed with a cup of liquid death. That was the moment everything fell apart. I whispered, the rage finally overriding the logic. I didn't have time for the door. I looked at the furnace, the old, coal-burning monster. I remembered the blueprints Kellen had left. The ventilation ducts didn't just carry heat, they carried sound. And if I could override the dampeners, they could carry a man. I turned to Milo, who was watching me with wide, terrified eyes. "Pray, Milo," I said, picking up the sledgehammer again. "Pray. The house holds together for one more hour." The adrenaline was a roar in my ears, drowning out the throbbing pain in my joints. I didn't waste another second on Milo, who was now whimpering against the workbench, his leg twisted at an angle that looked like a structural failure. I turned my attention to the furnace, the beating, mechanical heart of the house. Kellen's structural integrity folder hadn't just been about the cameras. It contained the original Motnyin Chintrum Haimu's HVAC schematics. This old Victorian had been retrofitted dozens of times, but the main trunk line, the central artery of the heating system, was wide, square, and made of heavy-gauge steel. It ran straight from the basement, up through the center of the house, and branched into the nursery. I grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from my discarded toolkit. With a series of violent, rhythmic strikes, I sheared off the bolts holding the main plenum cover in place. The metal groaned, a high-pitched scream of protesting iron that echoed up the vents. "Silas, what are you doing?" Milo hissed, his voice cracking. "You'll bring the whole damn ceiling down. Then I suggest you hold your breath," I replied, my voice like grinding stones. I tore the panel free, revealing the dark, cavernous mouth of the air shaft. It was tight, barely 20 inches wide, and coated in 80 years of soot and dust. To anyone else, it was a tomb. To a man who had spent his youth crawling inside the box girders of the Mackinac Bridge, it was a highway. I shoved Kellen's laptop into a canvas tool bag and slung it over my shoulder. I began to climb. The metal was freezing, the internal edges of the ducting sharp enough to slice through my flannel shirt. My breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps as the dust filled my lungs. But every time I felt my strength falter, I saw that image of the white bottle next to Quinn's milk. Push, brace, slide. I could hear Bryn's voice now, echoing through the thin metal walls. She was in the kitchen, directly above the basement. "Win, sweetie, stop that sobbing," Bryn said, her voice strained with a thin veneer of patience. "Pop is just resting. He's very tired. Drink your milk. It has the strawberry syrup you like." "I want Pop," Quinn wailed. Her voice was muffled, coming from the floor above the kitchen. "I want Daddy." "Daddy's gone, Quinn. And Pop is going soon too. Now drink." I reached the first junction. My fingers bled as I gripped the internal bracing. I wasn't just climbing a vent. I was navigating the hollowed-out soul of my own family. I pushed past the kitchen vent, catching a fleeting glimpse through the louvers of Bryn standing at the counter. She was holding a small plastic syringe, the plunger hovering over a blue-tinted liquid. I didn't stop to confront her. If I burst out now, she'd drop the syringe and play the victim, or worse, she'd lock herself in Quinn's room. I had to get to the child first. I reached the second floor. The duct narrowed, the heat from the furnace which had just kicked on beginning to bake the air around me. The smell of scorched dust was overwhelming. I felt a wave of dizziness, the antifreeze I'd ingested earlier finally beginning to claw at my nervous system. My vision blurred, the dark tunnel spinning. That was the moment I realized I might not make it out of the walls alive. I whispered, my forehead pressed against the hot steel. But then, a sound cut through the haze, the distinct, sharp clink of a glass hitting a nightstand. "Good girl." Bryn's voice came from the nursery vent, just inches from my face. "Finish it all. It'll make the bad dreams go away forever." I shoved my shoulder against the vent cover. It was screwed tight from the outside. I had no leverage, no room to swing. I looked down at the tool bag. I didn't have a hammer, but I had the next best thing. I pulled out Kellen's heavy engineering laptop. "I'm sorry, son," I muttered. I slammed the corner of the laptop against the louvered grate. Crack. The plastic snapped. I hit it again, the metal screws stripping from the ancient wood. With one final desperate surge of strength, I burst through the wall like a ghost rising from the grave. I tumbled onto the nursery carpet, covered in soot, blood, and gray insulation. Bryn screamed, dropping the syringe. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a primal, uncomprehending terror. I looked like a demon birthed from the house itself. But my eyes went straight to Quinn, who was holding the glass of milk to her lips. "Quinn, drop it," I roared. The glass shattered on the floor. Quinn scrambled to the corner of her bed, her face pale. Bryn recovered her senses, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She lunged for a heavy brass lamp on the dresser. "You just won't die, will you, you old bastard?" "I'm a bridge inspector." "Bryn," I said, rising slowly, my hand reaching into the tool bag for the one thing she didn't know I had. "I know exactly how much pressure a structure can take before it collapses. And you just hit your limit." I didn't pull out a weapon. I pulled out Milo's phone, still active, still recording. "Say hello to Garrett, Bryn. He's been listening to every word since I was in the kitchen vent." The silence that followed was heavier than the soot-laden air I dragged into the room. Bryn stood frozen, the brass lamp gripped in her hand like a primitive club. The manic glint in her eyes wavered, shifting from murderous intent to a frantic, darting calculation. She looked at the phone in my hand, then at the shattered glass of milk on the floor, the blue-tinted liquid seeping into the cream-colored carpet like a spreading bruise. "You're hallucinating, Silas," she hissed, though her voice lacked its usual surgical precision. "The chemicals, they're making you paranoid. You broke into a child's room. You're a danger to yourself. The only danger in this room is the woman holding the poison," I said, my voice low and vibrating with a fury I'd kept leashed for weeks. "Garrett isn't just listening, Bryn. He's 2 minutes out, and he's not coming alone." I could hear it then, the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens cutting through the quiet Ann Arbor night. It started as a faint hum, growing into a scream that tore through the facade of the suburban peace she had worked so hard to maintain. Bryn's face went gray. She dropped the lamp. It hit the carpet with a dull thud, narrowly missing the puddle of poisoned milk. She didn't look like a mastermind anymore. She looked like a cornered animal realizing the walls of its cage were electrified. "Pop." Quinn's voice was a small, broken thing. She was shaking, her eyes darting between my soot-covered face and her mother's trembling hands. "What's happening? Why is Mommy's medicine blue?" "It's not medicine, honey," I said, stepping toward her, though my legs felt like they were made of lead. "It's a secret Mommy didn't want us to find, but Daddy found it first." Bryn suddenly lunged, not for me, but for the door. She slammed it shut and turned the lock, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. "It doesn't matter what he heard," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "It's your word against mine. A senile old man who attacked his tenant in the basement. I'll tell them you went crazy. I'll tell them you tried to kill us all." "You forgot one thing, Bryn," I said, pointing toward the ceiling. "Kellen didn't just install cameras in the foyer. He was an engineer. He knew the most important part of any structure is the oversight." I gestured to the smoke detector above her head. A tiny, pinhole lens glinted in the light. "That camera has a dedicated battery backup and an off-site cloud uplink." I lied, knowing the laptop was the only hub, but I needed to break her spirit. "Everything you've said in this room, every time you reached for that syringe, it's already been uploaded to a secure server. You're not just being heard. You're being watched in high definition." Bryn's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, her expensive silk robe sprawling around her like a shroud. She started to laugh, a high, brittle sound that bordered on the edge of a total psychological break. "He always was so thorough," she sobbed. "Even from the grave, he's still checking my work." The front door downstairs exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire house. Police, hands in the air. Heavy boots thundered up the stairs, the same stairs I had just climbed through the darkness of the vents. I felt the poison in my blood finally win the battle for my consciousness. The room began to tilt, the edges of my vision fraying into white static. I saw the door of the nursery fly off its hinges. I saw Garrett's face, flint-eyed and grim, as he stepped over the threshold, his service weapon drawn. "Silas," he roared, catching me just as my knees hit the floor. "The milk, Garrett." I wheezed, my hand clutching his sleeve. "The milk and the syringe. Don't let them. Clean it up." "I've got it, Silas. I've got everything," he said, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Bryn being pressed into the carpet, the silver handcuffs clicking into place. It was the same sound as the deadbolt in the basement. But this time, I wasn't the one on the wrong side of the door. I thought the war was over. I thought the truth would set us free. But as I slipped into the black, I realized I hadn't even scratched the surface of the Ashford family's secrets. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and ozone, a sterile void that felt miles away from the damp, suffocating walls of my basement. When I finally opened my eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights felt like needles. My throat was raw, the metallic tang of the charcoal they'd used to pump the antifreeze from my stomach lingering like a bitter memory. Garrett was there, sitting in a plastic chair that looked too small for his frame. He looked like he hadn't slept since the Reagan administration. "You're a hard man to kill, Silas," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The doctor said if you'd waited another 20 minutes, your kidneys would have turned to glass. You're lucky you have a bridge inspector's constitution." "Gwyn?" I rasped, my voice cracking. "She's safe. Margaret is watching her. The child services people are involved, but since I'm family and Bryn is, well, currently residing in a holding cell, I've got temporary custody. She's asking for you." I closed my eyes, a wave of relief washing over me so strong it made my head swim. But the relief was short-lived. I remembered the look on Bryn's face when she realized she'd been caught, not the look of a woman who had lost everything, but the look of a woman who was already calculating her next move. "What about Milo?" I asked. "He's in the room next to yours. Under guard. You shattered his kneecap, Silas. He's looking at 3 surgeries and a 20-year sentence. He's already started talking. He's terrified of Bryn. He told the DA that the plan wasn't just the house. It was the insurance." Garrett leaned in closer, his face hardening into the mask of the detective who had spent 30 years in Detroit's grittiest precincts. "Silas, Bryn didn't just have a policy on Kellen. She had one on you. $1 million accidental death rider. And there's something else. We found a notebook in her car. A ledger." My pulse quickened. A ledger? She wasn't just funneling money into her own accounts. She was sending wire transfers to a woman in Tampa, Florida. A woman named Doris Hargrove. The name hit me like a physical blow. Doris was Bryn's mother. I'd only met her once, at the wedding. She was a woman who wore pearls like armor and smiled with her teeth, never her eyes. Kellen had always been uneasy around her, saying she treated every conversation like a deposition. Why would she be sending her mother money? I asked. Because Doris isn't just her mother, Garrett said, sliding a manila folder onto my bed tray. She's a forensic accountant who specialized in estate liquidations. Or, as the FBI currently suspects, she's the architect behind at least 3 other tragic family deaths in the Southeast. Bryn wasn't just a rogue actor, Silas. She was an apprentice. This was a family business. I stared at the folder. Inside were photos of 3 men, different states, different years, all of whom had died of natural causes while married to women connected to Doris Hargrove's firm. One had died of a sudden diabetic coma, another of respiratory failure. The third had fallen from a balcony. They were harvesting us, Garrett, I whispered, the horror of it settling into my bones. We weren't a family to her. We were a crop. I didn't know it yet, I added, looking at the door of my hospital room as it swung open. But the harvest wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A man in a dark suit walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. He wasn't a doctor. He was an investigator from the district attorney's office. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional urgency. "Mr. Vance," he said, "we have a problem. Bryn Ashford just posted bail. It was a staggering amount, $500,000, and it was wired from an offshore account in the Caymans within an hour of her booking." I felt the room turn cold. The system was failing. The bridge was swaying. "Where is she now?" I demanded, trying to sit up despite the tubes in my arms. "We don't know," the investigator admitted. "She surrendered her passport, but a woman like that doesn't need a passport to disappear. But before she left a message for you with the duty sergeant." He pulled a small, handwritten note from his pocket and laid it on the tray. It was written in Bryn's elegant, flowing script. "Silas, you forgot the most important rule of engineering. The secondary supports are always the hardest to see. I'm coming for my daughter, and I'm coming for the rest of my inheritance." I looked at Garrett. He was already reaching for his holster. I realized then that the arrest hadn't been the end. It had just been the opening bell. The Ashford family hadn't just built a cage for me. They had built a fortress, and I was still trapped inside the ruins of my own life. That was the moment I realized, I said, my voice steadying into a cold, hard resolve, that if the law couldn't protect my granddaughter, the bridge inspector would have to burn the whole structure down. The hospital room felt like a glass cage. The news of Bryn's release didn't just rattle me. It felt like a structural failure in the foundation of justice itself. $500,000. That wasn't just savings. That was the blood money she had siphoned from Kellen's engineering firm, laundered through Doris's consulting shell companies, and held in reserve for this exact catastrophe. "How is she out, Garrett?" I barked, ripping the heart monitor sensor off my chest. The machine let out a frantic, flatline wail that matched the panic rising in my gut. "She tried to kill me. She almost poisoned Quinn." The judge saw a grieving widow with no prior record and a high-priced attorney who argued the toxicology was inconclusive until the state lab finishes a full panel. Garrett growled, his hand already on his radio. "Doris Hargrove has deep roots, Silas. She knows which palms to grease to keep her investments walking free." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the world spinning in nauseating circles. The doctors had warned me about the lingering effects of the ethylene glycol, the way it turns the blood acidic and the mind foggy. But the thought of Bryn out there, hunting for Quinn, acted like a shot of pure adrenaline. "We have to go," I said, my voice cracking. "She's going to Margaret's house." "Margaret and Quinn are already in a safe house," Garrett said, but his eyes told a different story. "But Silas, the safe house was a police-approved location. If Doris has people on the inside of the county clerk's office, nowhere is safe." "I didn't know it then," I whispered. "But the secondary supports Bryn mentioned in her note weren't people. They were ghosts." I forced myself to stand, my muscles screaming in protest. I made Garrett drive me back to the Victorian. I didn't want the hospital, I wanted the archives. If Kellen had known enough to rig the smoke detectors, he had known enough to protect the one thing Bryn wanted more than the money: the prototype. The house looked different in the gray light of dawn. The yellow police tape fluttered in the wind like a warning flag. Inside, the air was stagnant, smelling of the drywall dust I'd kicked up and the lingering, sour scent of Milo's fear. I headed straight for the basement. My legs were heavy, every step a battle against the poison still circulating in my veins. I bypassed the workbench where Milo had been taped and went to the false wall I'd smashed through. Behind the steel prototype of the Motramhai KV project was a small, fireproof data safe. I used the code again, Numuilam, and the door clicked open. Inside wasn't more money or more video. It was a single leather-bound ledger. Kellen's handwriting was frantic in these pages. It was a diary of his own slow murder. August Murhaith. The insulin tastes metallic. Bryn insisted on cleaning the vials. My glucose is spiking to bone chum after every meal she cooks. I think she's swapping the saline. If you're reading this, Dad, look at the offshore wire transfers. Doris is the architect, Bryn is just the builder. But they made one mistake. They didn't realize I've been siphoning the stolen funds back into an escrow account they can't touch without my biometric key. I gasped at the realization hitting me like a falling girder. Bryn hadn't just posted bail with her own money. She had used a high-interest bridge loan from a private lender, expecting to pay it back instantly with Kellen's hidden millions. But the money wasn't there. It was locked in a digital vault that required Kellen's thumbprint or mine. She's broke, Garrett, I said, holding the ledger up. She's out on bail, but she's leveraged to the hilt with people who don't take no for an answer. She's desperate, and a desperate predator doesn't hide, she strikes. Suddenly, the house's security system chirped. It was a low-frequency alert I'd only heard once before. Someone had just bypassed the front gate using a master code. I looked at the monitor in the basement. A black SUV had pulled into the driveway, but it wasn't the police. A woman stepped out of the passenger side. She was older, wearing a tailored cream suit and a string of pearls that caught the morning light. Doris Hargrove. She didn't look like a grandmother. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. And behind her, stepping out of the driver's side with a cold, clinical smile, was Bryn. She wasn't wearing silk anymore. She was wearing tactical black, and in her hand was a legal document, a court-ordered emergency injunction for the protection of her daughter. They aren't here for me, I whispered, the cold dread finally turning into a sharpening blade of resolve. They're here to take Quinn and disappear forever. And they brought the law with them. The front door handle rattled. What happened next, I told the shadows, was the moment I realized that being an inspector wasn't enough. I had to become the wrecking ball. The sound of the front door opening wasn't a crash this time. It was the smooth, authorized turn of a key. Bryn hadn't just posted bail. She had regained legal standing. As a mother who hadn't been convicted of anything yet, she had secured an emergency ex parte order. In the eyes of the state of Michigan at this very second, I was just a medically compromised grandfather who had abducted a child into a hazardous basement. Silas. Doris's voice floated down the stairs. It was melodic, cultured, and absolutely lethal. We know you're down there, dear. Let's not make this difficult. We have the sheriff's deputies waiting at the end of the drive. They'll be here in 5 minutes to escort Quinn home. Garrett reached for his radio, but I grabbed his wrist. No. If you call it in, the deputies will have to enforce that order. They don't know about the antifreeze yet. They only see the paperwork Doris bought and paid for. I looked at the ledger in my hand, the key to the escrow account. Bryn and Doris were standing on a bridge made of glass, and they didn't realize I was holding the hammer. I didn't know it then, I whispered to Garrett. But Doris isn't here for the child. She's here for the biometric key. I stepped out from behind the false wall and walked toward the stairs. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was a sharp, focused beam. I met them in the kitchen, the very place where Kellen had taken his last sip of poison. Doris stood by the island, checking her diamond watch. Bryn stood by the window, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, a frantic energy radiating off her. She looked like she wanted to tear the house apart with her bare hands. The girl, Silas. Where is she? Bryn demanded. She's exactly where you can't get to her, I said, leaning against the counter for support. But let's talk about why you're really here, Doris. The bridge loan. The $500,000 you borrowed from those investors in Miami to get Bryn out of jail. Doris's smile didn't falter, but her eyes turned into 2 chips of flint. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas. I'm simply here to reunite a mother and child after a tragic misunderstanding. You're here because the accounts are empty, I countered, throwing Kellen's ledger onto the marble island. The sound was like a gunshot. Kellen didn't just record you, Bryn. He out-engineered you. He moved every cent of the life insurance, the equity, and the firm's liquid assets into a blind trust. And the only way to unlock it is a two-factor biometric scan. I held up my thumb. Me and Quinn. He knew you'd kill him, but he bet that you wouldn't kill both of us if we were the only way you could get paid. The mask finally slipped. Bryn lunged across the kitchen, her fingers clawing at my face. But Garrett stepped between us, his hand on his holster. Touch him and you go back to the cage, Bryn. Order or no order, Garrett growled. Doris stepped forward, placing a restraining hand on her daughter's shoulder. Her voice dropped to a cold, clinical whisper, the sound of a predator deciding which part of the prey to eat first. You're a bridge inspector, Silas. You should understand the concept of a controlled demolition. If you don't give us the access codes and the child, I will make sure the narrative of your mental collapse includes a tragic accident involving your brother's service weapon. By the time the deputies get to the door, there will be 2 dead old men and a frantic mother who acted in self-defense. I looked at the clock on the wall, the same clock Kellen had rigged. That was the moment everything changed, I said, a slow, grim smile spreading across my face. Because I wasn't just waiting for the police, Doris. I was waiting for the investors you robbed. I reached into my pocket and hit a button on Milo's phone. A live GPS tracker flared to life on the screen. Milo didn't just talk to the DA, Doris. He was so scared of you that he gave up your Miami contacts. He told them you were planning to skip the country with their $500,000 bail loan without paying them back. I sent them the address 10 minutes ago. The sound of a heavy, high-performance engine rumbled at the front gate. It wasn't the rhythmic whoop of a police siren. It was the low, predatory growl of a blacked-out sedan. Doris's face went a shade of gray I had only seen on a morgue slab. She turned to the window, her hand trembling as she touched her pearls. "What have you done?" she whispered. "I didn't break the bridge, Doris," I said, my voice as steady as an iron pylon. "I just removed the paint so everyone could see the rot." The front door didn't open this time. It was kicked off its hinges with a violence that made the Victorian shudder. The men who stepped through the shattered remains of my front door didn't wear badges. They wore tailored leather jackets and an aura of professional, quiet violence that made the air in the kitchen turn frigid. There were 3 of them, led by a man with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen the bottom of 1,000 shallow graves. Doris stood frozen, her hand still clutching her pearls so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Bryn, for the first time in her life, looked truly small. She backed away from the marble island, her gaze darting toward the back exit, but the second man was already there, blocking the path to the mudroom. "Doris," the lead man said, his voice a gravelly, pleasant tone that was far more terrifying than a shout. "We had an agreement. The bail loan was a short-term bridge. You told us the Vance estate was liquid. You told us the payout was guaranteed." It is, Elias," Doris stammered, her cultured veneer dissolving into a frantic, high-pitched plea. "The old man is just being difficult. He has the codes. I just need a little more time." Elias looked at me, then at the ledger on the counter. He was a man who lived by the math of the street, and he could see the structural failure in her eyes. "Time is a luxury you spent on that cream suit, Doris. My associates in Miami don't like being used as a revolving credit line for a failing murder-for-hire scheme." "Wait," Bryn shrieked, pointing at me. "He's lying. He's trying to set us up. He has the money in a trust." I didn't blink. I stood my ground, feeling the hum of the house beneath my feet, the frequency Kellen had calibrated. "The money is in an escrow account that freezes permanently if a juris code is entered," I said, my voice cutting through the panic. "And I just entered it." "I didn't know it then," I whispered. But the final collapse wasn't going to be a legal one. It was going to be a total liquidation. Elias stepped closer to Doris. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was enough to make her sag against the counter. "You brought us into a family squabble, Doris. That was your second mistake. Your first was thinking you could outsmart a man who spends his life looking for the point where things break." Suddenly, the rhythmic whoop-whoop of real police sirens erupted from the end of the driveway. Garrett had finally managed to bypass the county clerk's interference and bring in the state police. The red and blue lights began to pulse against the kitchen wallpaper, turning the room into a strobe-lit nightmare. "The law is here, Elias," Garrett said, his hand steady on his weapon. "You want to walk out of here? You do it now." My fight isn't with you. It's with the two vultures standing next to you. Elias looked at the window, then back at Doris. He gave a sharp, clinical nod to his men. The debt doesn't go away just because you're in handcuffs, Doris. In fact, the interest rate just doubled. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, slipping out through the back just as the first state trooper kicked through the side door. Bryn fell to her knees, sobbing not out of regret, but out of the sheer, crushing weight of her own failure. Doris just stood there, staring at the empty ledger. She looked like a bridge that had finally lost its anchor bolts, swaying in a wind she couldn't control. "It's over, Doris," I said, my voice heavy with the exhaustion of 1,000 lifetimes. "The harvest is finished." "You think you've won?" Doris hissed, her eyes snapping back to mine with a final venomous spark. "I've spent 40 years building lives out of other people's graves. You're just one old man in a crumbling house." "I'm the man who's still standing," I replied. But as the officers moved in to secure them, the floorboards beneath the kitchen island let out a sharp, piercing crack. A smell of ozone and hot copper filled the room. The house's security system, the one Kellen had rigged, wasn't just a camera. It was a fail-safe. What I saw next, I told the lead trooper as he grabbed my arm to pull me back, was the moment Kellen's final plan went live. The kitchen island didn't just shift, it began to sink. A hidden hydraulic lift, triggered by the duress code, was pulling the central hub of the house's evidence into the very basement they had tried to bury me in. And as the floor opened, a hidden compartment in the island popped open, revealing the one thing Bryn had missed. Kellen's original, untampered with insulin vials, preserved in a temperature-controlled vacuum. Physical evidence. Irrefutable. Fatal. The sound of the hydraulic lift was a low, industrial hum that vibrated through the soles of my boots, a mechanical purr that sounded like Kellen's final laugh. As the floor gap widened, the kitchen island, the very altar where Bryn had prepared her daily sacrifices of liquid death, descended into the darkness. Bryn let out a primal, guttural scream, lunging toward the opening as if she could catch the evidence with her bare hands. But Garrett caught her by the waist, pinning her back as the state troopers swarmed the room. "The vials," the lead trooper breathed, staring into the illuminated compartment that had risen from the depths. "Are those what I think they are?" "They're the smoking gun," I said, my voice finally steadying. Kellen knew she was swapping his medicine. He didn't throw the old vials away. He hid them in the only place she couldn't reach without the house's permission. I looked at Doris. The woman who had built a career on the quiet erasure of men was now staring into the abyss of a forensic nightmare. The vials weren't just plastic and glass. They were vessels of truth, holding the exact chemical signature of the saline and irritants she had coached her daughter to use. "I didn't know it then," I whispered, watching the officers carefully bag the evidence. But the vials were only the first layer of the reversal. As the troopers led Bryn and Doris toward the waiting squad cars, the neighborhood began to wake up. Neighbors I had known for decades, people who had watched me being treated like a senile intruder in my own yard, stood on their porches in bathrobes, their faces illuminated by the strobe-like pulse of the emergency lights. Bryn was screaming about her rights, about her daughter, her voice cracking until it was nothing more than a jagged, ugly rasp. Doris, ever the professional, remained silent, but her hands were shaking so violently that the handcuffs rattled against her wrists like a death knell. Once they were gone, the house felt cavernous. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind I'd felt in the basement. It was the light, airy silence of a structure that had finally been cleared of its rot. "You need to sit down, Silas," Garrett said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You're gray as a tombstone." "I can't sit yet," I replied. "I have to find the second half of the code." "The second half?" I pointed to the ledger. Kellen's note said the escrow account was locked by a two-factor biometric scan. Me and Quinn. The Juris's code I entered earlier didn't just hide the money. It sent a signal to a very specific legal firm in Detroit. I picked up the house phone. I'd seen a notification on the screen, a return call from a number I'd been trying to reach for days. Jonathan Reeves, Kellen's old mentor and one of the sharpest estate attorneys in the Midwest. "Silas." Jonathan's voice was crisp, cutting through the static of my exhaustion. The signal just hit my desk. "The Mochumheimwitam Kavebai protocol is active. Does this mean what I think it means?" "It means the bridge is clear, Jonathan," I said. I need the immediate freeze orders for the Florida properties and the seizure of the DH management assets. We have the evidence. We have the confession on the cloud server. And most importantly, we have the builder. What about the bail loan, Silas? Jonathan asked, his tone turning serious. The people Milo mentioned. The ones in Miami. They don't wait for court dates. They've already been here, I said, looking at the shattered front door. And they realize the only way they get their $500,000 back is by cooperating with the DA to nail Doris for money laundering. I've turned her own debt into the state's biggest witness. I hung up and looked at the kitchen floor. The gap was closing now, the island returning to its place, sealing the secrets of the Vance family back into the foundation. But as I turned to leave, I saw a glint of something in the corner of the pantry. A small, silver digital recorder. It was pinned to the underside of the shelf. I hit play. I don't care if he's his father, Milo, Bryn's voice hissed from the speaker, a recording from weeks ago. Doris says the basement is the final stage. Once he's gone, we sell the timber rights on the northern lot and the house to that developer. We'll be in the air before the funeral is over. And the girl? Milo's voice asked. She's in Ashford, Bryn replied. She'll learn to forget, just like I did. I gripped the recorder until the plastic bit into my palm. They hadn't just been killing us for the money. They were grooming the next generation of monsters. The reversal wasn't just about the house or the bank accounts. It was about breaking the cycle. That was the moment I realized. I said, looking at Garrett, that the smartest thing I ever did wasn't calling you. It was trusting that my son was even smarter than the woman who killed him. The morning of the preliminary hearing felt like the final inspection of a condemned skyscraper. The air in the courthouse was thick with the scent of old paper and the electric hum of the media's cameras. I sat in the front row, my back straight, wearing the suit I had bought for Kellen's funeral. Beside me sat Garrett and Jonathan Reeves, our legal shield. When they led Bryn into the room, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The grieving widow was gone. Without her expensive salons and designer clothes, she looked haggard, her skin the color of damp ash, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. Doris followed behind her, still trying to maintain a regal posture. But the way she avoided the gaze of the DA told me the foundation of her confidence had finally buckled. I didn't know it then, I whispered to Garrett as the judge took the bench. But the final reversal wasn't coming from a lawyer. It was coming from a chemist. The prosecution called Dr. Eris Thorne, the state's lead toxicologist. He stood at the podium and presented the analysis of the vials Kellen had hidden. The samples recovered from the kitchen island do not contain insulin, Dr. Thorne stated, his voice clinical and cold. They contain a concentrated solution of industrial-grade saline mixed with a heavy metal irritant. Furthermore, the electrolyte powder found in the nursery was 80% pure ethylene glycol. He turned to the jury box, holding up a digital slide of Kellen's kidney tissue. These jagged shapes you see are calcium oxalate crystals. In my 20 years of forensic work, I have never seen a more deliberate, slow-motion execution. The victim was essentially being turned to glass from the inside out. Bryn let out a low, whimpering sound, but Doris remained a statue. Then came the turning point. Jonathan Reeves stood up, not to cross-examine, but to present a discovery of interest that Kellen had left for this exact moment. He opened a laptop and projected a video file that wasn't from the smoke detectors. It was from a hidden camera inside Kellen's engineering office, a room Bryn thought she had scrubbed clean. The video showed Milo Redmond and Bryn standing over Kellen's blueprints. But they weren't looking at bridges. They were looking at a life insurance policy. Is the old man's signature a match? Milo's voice was clear as a bell. Perfect, Bryn replied, her face illuminated by the glow of a light table. Doris spent 6 weeks practicing it. Once Kellen is out of the way, Silas will be confused enough to sign the house over. By the time anyone asks questions, we'll be in Tampa. And the detective brother, he's in Detroit, Bryn scoffed. He won't look at a bridge inspector's accidental fall. He'll just see another old man who lost his footing. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered her gavel until the wood nearly splintered. Bryn's attorney tried to shout for an objection, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a paper cup. The secondary supports Bryn had bragged about, the lies, the forgeries, the manufactured dementia, were snapping one by one. I watched Doris. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. For a second, the mask of the general was gone. and I saw the predator's true face. Pure, unadulterated hatred. She knew the game was up. She knew the DH management accounts had been drained by the Miami investors and the federal freeze orders. She was a queen without a kingdom, standing in the ruins of her own greed. That was the moment I realized. I told the room, though I didn't say it out loud, that revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's a bridge that you build one truth at a time until the other side has nowhere left to run. The judge looked at the defendants, her face a mask of iron. Based on the evidence presented, the forensic toxicology, the recorded premeditation, and the direct testimony of the accomplice, Milo Redmond, I am denying bail. Both defendants will be remanded to the county jail pending trial for first-degree murder and attempted homicide. As the bailiffs moved in, Bryn finally broke. She didn't scream at me. She turned on her mother. "You said this was foolproof," she shrieked, clawing at Doris's tailored sleeve. "You said the old man was a dinosaur. You promised me Florida." Doris didn't answer. She just looked at the handcuffs being snapped around her wrists, the pearls around her neck looking like the very noose she had tied for my son. As they were let out, I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from Margaret at the safe house. "Quinn is eating ice cream. She says she wants to know if Pop-Pop is coming home to build the birdhouse today." I stood up, my legs finally feeling strong. The poison of the last 2 years finally flushed out of my soul. I wasn't just a bridge inspector anymore. I was a grandfather. And for the first time in my life, the structure of my future looked solid. The trial of the century, or at least the one that felt like it in the dark heart of Michigan, was over. The sentencing phase hadn't been a negotiation. It had been a demolition. With Milo Redmond trading his testimony for a life sentence without the death penalty, the dominoes had fallen with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. Bryn Ashford was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Doris Hargrove, the architect of the family business, received the same, plus 20 years for the multi-state racketeering and money laundering charges that the FBI had finally pinned to her chest. The harvest was over, and the barn was empty. I sat in the quiet of the Victorian living room 3 days later. The heavy oak door had been replaced, the shattered glass swept away, but the house still felt like it was holding its breath. The "Always Home" inscription on the underside of Kellen's ring felt warm against my skin as I turned the gold band over and over. I didn't know it then. I whispered into the empty hallway, but the final reversal wasn't about the money or the prison cells. It was about the name Vance. Jonathan Reeves walked into the room, his briefcase looking heavier than usual. He didn't sit down. He just leaned against the mantel, looking at the mended photograph of Kellen that I'd placed back in its rightful spot. "The escrow accounts have been cleared, Silas," Jonathan said. "Every cent of the life insurance, the equity from the Florida seizures, and the liquidated assets from DH management has been moved into the trust. Quinn is the wealthiest 10-year-old in the state." "And the Miami loan?" I asked. "Settled. Elias and his associates took a finder's fee for their cooperation with the DA and disappeared back into the Everglades. They know if they ever come near this house again, Garrett has enough on them to bury them in a federal hole for 50 years. You're clear, Silas." I looked at the window. The cherry tree we'd planted was a dark silhouette against the twilight. It was a sturdy little thing, its roots beginning to grip the earth where the surveillance van once stood. "There's one more thing," Jonathan added, pulling a single thick document from his bag. "Kellen's final patent, the Motrumheimuitam KV project. It wasn't just a prototype for a bridge sensor. It's a decentralized encryption system for medical records. It's designed to prevent the exact kind of data tampering Bryn used to hide his insulin spikes." I felt a lump form in my throat. My son hadn't just been trying to catch his killer. He had been trying to build a bridge that would protect every other vulnerable person in the world from a monster like Bryn. "He saved us, Jonathan," I said, my voice thick. "He built a fortress out of math and love. He did. And now, the board of the Engineering Society wants to name the new suspension bridge over the Huron River after him. The Kellen Vance Memorial Bridge." I stood up, walking to the window. The house finally exhaled. The creaks in the floorboards didn't sound like footsteps anymore. They sounded like the home settling into a long, deserved sleep. But as I watched the sun set, I noticed something in the garden. A small white envelope was tucked into the bark of the cherry tree. I walked out into the cool evening air, my heart hammering. I pulled the envelope free. There was no stamp, no return address. Just my name written in a hand I didn't recognize. I opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of Kellen when he was 6 years old, standing on the very first bridge I'd ever taken him to, the old covered bridge in Aita. He was smiling, holding a toy hammer, looking up at me with eyes full of hero worship. On the back, written in a shaky, elegant hand that I realized was my wife Eleanor's, were 3 words. The pillars held. I sank onto the garden bench, the photo pressed to my heart. Eleanor had hidden this somewhere, years ago, knowing perhaps with a mother's intuition that there would come a day when the structure of our family would be tested to its breaking point. She had left me a reminder that a bridge isn't just made of steel and concrete. It's made of the people who refuse to let it fall. That was the moment I finally cried. I whispered to the blossoms, not for the betrayal, not for the basement, but for the beauty of a plan that took 30 years to finish. I looked up and saw Quinn standing at the back door. She was wearing Kellen's old engineering sweatshirt, the sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked like a Vance. "Pop, Pop," she called out. "Are you coming in? The birdhouse needs a roof, and I can't find the level." "I'm coming, Quinn," I said, wiping my eyes. "I'm coming home." The final morning of the Mutram Mutam KV by era arrived with a quietness that felt like a benediction. It had been exactly 2 years since the night the deadbolt clicked shut in the basement, and as I stood in the kitchen fully remodeled, the hydraulic floor now a permanent, locked slab of solid oak, I realized that the house had finally forgotten the scent of bleach and betrayal. I watched through the window as the first spring buds on Kellen's cherry tree began to unfurl, their pale pink petals looking like delicate repairs to the landscape. Quinn was out there, her head bent over a sketchbook, her small fingers tracing the geometric patterns of the leaves. She didn't look over her shoulder anymore. She didn't flinch at the sound of a car in the drive. She was a Vance, rooted and rising. Garrett walked into the kitchen, his retirement beard flecked with gray, carrying a box of old blueprints. The city approved the naming ceremony, Silas. The Vance Memorial Bridge officially opens on the anniversary of the verdict. Kellen's math is going to hold up the heaviest traffic in the county. "It's not just the traffic I'm worried about, Garrett," I said, pouring 2 mugs of coffee, black, honest, and bitter. "It's the foundation. Did the firm find the final encryption key?" Garrett nodded, his face softening. "They did. It turns out the secondary supports Bryn was so worried about weren't just the cameras. Kellen had coded a digital inheritance that releases a yearly scholarship in his name for students who specialize in medical ethics and engineering. He made sure that even if she took his life, she could never take his legacy. I didn't know it then," I whispered, looking at the mended photograph on the mantel. But the final twist wasn't a legal one. It was a moral one. As we prepared to leave for the bridge ceremony, a courier arrived with a final, heavy package from the state prosecutor's office. It was a box of personal effects returned from the evidence locker, things that had been taken from Bryn's car the night of her arrest. I reached into the box, my fingers brushing against the cold, artificial texture of the plastic lilies Bryn had left at the cemetery. I pulled them out, intending to throw them in the trash, but something felt wrong. The weight was uneven. I took a utility knife and sliced into the leaded base of the plastic bouquet. A small, vacuum-sealed SD card fell into my palm. My heart skipped. It wasn't Kellen's. It was Doris's. I took it to the study, my hands steady as I plugged it into the laptop. A single folder appeared. Insurance Registry, Mutngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Lam Haingin Lea Hai Mui Bon. As the files loaded, the air in the room seemed to freeze. It wasn't just 3 other men. The ledger contained a list of over 20 names, men across 4 decades, all connected to Doris Hargrove's estates, but it was the very first entry that broke my heart. Mutngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Hai. Arthur Vance. Cause: cardiac arrest. Payout: Bon Chum Nam Mui Khong. Arthur Vance. My father. The realization hit me with the force of a structural collapse. Doris hadn't just targeted Kellen. She had started with my own family 30 years ago. My father's sudden heart attack, the one that had left my mother a penniless widow, hadn't been an act of God. It had been the pilot program for Doris's empire of graves. "She's been hunting us for a generation, Garrett," I rasped, showing him the screen. "She didn't choose Bryn for Kellen by accident. She chose Kellen because she knew the Vance bloodline was a profitable harvest." Garrett gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. 30 years, Silas. We were under her microscope for 30 years. But she missed one thing. I said, my voice rising with a final, crystalline clarity. She thought we were just the timber. She didn't realize we were the engineers. I didn't call the police. I didn't need to. I forwarded the data directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, adding the final nail to a coffin Doris would never leave. Then, I took the plastic lilies and the SD card to the fireplace. I watched the fake flowers melt into a black, toxic sludge, the smoke rising up the chimney and vanishing into the Michigan sky. The bridge ceremony was beautiful. As Quinn and I cut the ribbon, the sun hit the steel cables of the Vance Memorial Bridge, making them glow like golden threads. I stood at the center span, looking down at the water, feeling the strength of the structure vibrating through my feet. A house is like a bridge. It doesn't matter how much weight you put on it or how many storms try to tear it down. If the anchor bolts are made of truth, and the pylons are built on love, it will never fall. I looked at the ring on my finger, the one that said always home. I realized then that Kellen hadn't just died. He had transformed into the very ground we stood on. He was the safety we felt, the justice we'd won, and the future Quinn was already sketching. Pop, Quinn asked, taking my hand as we walked toward the car. What are we doing tomorrow? I smiled, the last of the basement shadows finally dissolving into the light. Tomorrow, Quinn, I said, we're going to look at the blueprints for your new workshop, and this time we aren't building any false walls. The bridge was clear, the road was open, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just looking for cracks. I was looking at the horizon.